Oh, no, no countdown. Here we go. Hi, everybody. Live. Joe Moore here with Hamilton Morris. Hamilton, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going pretty well, decently.
I'm excited to have you on because you just spent a bunch of time in Washington, D.C. around this DEA, DOI, DOC thing where DEA is trying to schedule DOI, DOC, and it looks really inappropriate, even based on their rules, that they would be doing this. And really excited to learn about your perspectives and experiences there in D.C. So I guess to set the stage, can you tell us a little bit about what exactly the DEA was trying to do here?
Yeah. So this is like a very extreme example of a terrible thing that has been going on for half a century, where the DEA has an enormous amount of power. They are able to simultaneously make laws and enforce those laws, which of course is a recipe for corruption. And the Controlled Substances Act, whatever, good intentions may or may not have existed during its drafting, has gotten so totally out of control that it's at the point where they're just throwing drugs into it that aren't even drugs. Like, there are a number of substances in the Controlled Substances Act that not only don't meet the criteria for being included, they're not even drugs at all, like P2P or PCC. They just threw them in there. Like, well, they're precursors for, and 2CH would be another example. So you have three non-psychoactive molecules that are just included because no one objected. And it was becoming increasingly clear that they would schedule anything and that no one would object to it because it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's frightening, it's confusing. The whole, because they make the rules, you're not even in a situation where logic or reason will prevail necessarily, because they've constructed the rules of the game in such a way that no matter how reasonable or honest or truthful your arguments may be, they can still win. And even in the rare instances where they rule in favor of science or medicine, like they did in the 1980s with MDMA, this is like a kind of important thing. The DEA administrative law judge ruled in favor of not placing MDMA in Schedule 1, and they did it anyway. So everything is extremely stacked in their favor, so much so that they don't necessarily take the advice of their own judges and can just continue to prohibit things. And for a long time, they would prohibit drugs that nobody cared about. And that's, I think, also a kind of dangerous thing, because on one hand, you could say, oh, it's just fentanyl analogs. They probably should be controlled substances because aren't they dangerous and aren't they drugs of abuse? But this neglects to recognize the fundamental problem, which is that the prohibition of substances has never been an effective method for preventing the harms associated with some types of drug use. It doesn't prevent people from using drugs. If anything, it seems to actually exacerbate many of those harms and is extremely ineffective for its stated purpose. So when they would propose the prohibition of these fentanyl analogs, no one would ever stand up for them. No one wants to be the person who's going to, say, oh, no, don't take acetylfentanyl. But the reality is all of these things are important. They're useful for scientists. They are useful for research. And we don't even know what they may or may not be, because once something is prohibited, it becomes immensely difficult to study it. Like, it has absolutely been the case that we have prohibited substances, and it's not until after they're illegal that we recognize that they have some kind of tremendous value for medicine or science. A prime example would be ibogaine in substance use disorder. There's a number of papers on the anti-rabies activity of bufotenine. Like, most people have never even heard of bufotenine, and then maybe it has very powerful antiviral activity that only a small number of labs have ever even had the opportunity to examine, because in the United States, it's a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Or the use of 2,5-dimethoxyamphetamine in the manufacture of Polaroid film, right? Like, there's just like it's a very limited view of a molecule to think that what we know about it at some point in time represents everything that that molecule could be or do. It may have all sorts of completely unanticipated effects. And something like acetylfentanyl that you might think, oh, whatever, let them prohibit acetylfentanyl. Well, maybe there's something very useful about acetylfentanyl that could actually help people who have opioid use problems or whatever. So, but anyway, they were doing this for a while, lots of synthetic cannabinoids, lots of cathinones, lots of opioids. And then they started to go after psychedelics again in a big way. And there were 5 tryptamines and 2 psychedelic amphetamines that they proposed. And this was in, I believe it was 2021, right? And they initially withdrew their intention. I was very involved in the efforts to prevent the prohibition of the 5 tryptamines because one of them had been a compound that I'd spent many years studying. But and just getting to the point where they had organized the hearing, you have to organize hotels and flights, and it's very expensive, labor intensive stuff. And then they cancel the hearing. I'd done a whole fundraiser, all this stuff. I'd made these t-shirts that say the DEA is a terrorist organization. It was selling them to cover the cost of the legal defense. Like all this stuff was actually hugely, hugely time consuming. You have to write all these documents. You have to spend all this time trying to think through their conceptualization of these drugs. They canceled the hearing, and it was a tremendous relief. But it also it just shows like, okay, this is why nobody stands up for these things. This is why no one stood up for 2CN when it was being prohibited, because it's hugely labor intensive and requires the effort of like dozens of experts to get to the point where you can even argue your case in front of the DEA. And then they came back for more with DOI and DOC.
Yeah, not until recently, Hamilton, did I realize how integral DOI was to psychedelic and serotonergic research. It's really fascinating how many people are actively working with these this molecule. I don't know how popular DOC is. Is it very popular in labs?
Yeah, it's definitely been used for many, many years. Like it was one of the early considered high selectivity 5-HT2A agonist by today's standards. It's not quite as selective, but the other importance of it is that it was the substance that people had access to for research if they didn't have a Schedule I license. So if you were someone who's, just wondering like, oh, I wonder about 2A's influence on whatever disorder, DOI was the substance that you could get from a chemical supply company and do a couple pilot experiments, which is really important in science. Like, this is a big part of the DEA's argument during the hearing was like, oh, well, you can get this license. It's not that big of a deal. You just have to fill out some paperwork and do this and that and the other. But the reality is that if you make something sufficiently bureaucratic, people just won't do it unless it is their only thing, unless their whole life revolves around studying the serotonin 2A receptor. And that's all they want to do. Like David E. Nichols, for example, made that case that for him, the bureaucracy was not a big deal because he knew from the beginning that that was going to be his life. But there's a lot of people who aren't David E. Nichols who are just thinking, oh, it would be interesting to look in this colon cancer cell line that I just noticed expresses 5-HT2B. Maybe this could be an interesting little pilot experiment to run. And if they have to wait 1 year and get a safe and a license and have law enforcement go through all their stuff, go to the lab, audit everything, they might just say, fuck it, I won't do that. Actually, it's too much trouble. And I know for a fact that this is the case. I've worked in a lab like this where people just thought, too much work, let's not do it. I see it all the time. And so the argument that this would be a tremendous hindrance to research is extremely true and evidence-based. And their efforts to minimize it were contradicted by every single expert who appeared at the trial. again and again and again, expert after expert testified that the amount of time required to get the Schedule 1 license was 1 year. And so by having DOI available, this allows you to do research with psychedelics without waiting 1 year. And it also has the advantage of having this tremendous literature precedent. So like this was the other argument they're making, is like, oh, well, there's other stuff now. And technically speaking, that's true. There are other things now. There's something called TCB2, but thankfully their lawyers weren't knowledgeable enough to even recognize this. But yeah, there's some other stuff out there. But one issue with that is that if you have some brand new thing, it's actually difficult from a scientific perspective because you can't contextualize it with the broader literature. So like, okay, you get TCB2 or whatever, but DOI is nice because there are literally thousands of peer-reviewed scientific articles that have used DOI, and you can then do direct comparisons with all of those previous articles using a known reference compound that if it is gone, it will create huge, huge problems so big that, and I'm usually not very sympathetic to this claim that I'm about to make. And I usually regard such claims with tremendous skepticism when people talk about like the government knows, man, like they're doing it because they want people hooked on opioids, man, like that kind of. I'm normally very much against that kind of thing and instead favor a kind of stupidity based explanation. But in this instance, I feel that a case can actually be made that there would be some degree of intentionality in an effort to hobble scientific research on psychedelics, because you will never find a compound with a more scientifically skewed ratio of use to abuse. We're talking like thousands of scientific papers and arguably not a single truly confirmed instance of human use outside of peak hall. So yeah, it's a pretty, this is why this one was so important. Some people might say, oh, DOI, like who cares? It's like, no, this is actually very important. This is truly important to scientists, both as this actual compound, but then also more broadly speaking, symbolically, as like, you can't just misuse the Controlled Substances Act to take these drugs that truly don't meet the criteria in any meaningful way, prohibit them, and interfere with the lives of thousands of scientists.
Mm-hmm. So let's rewind the tape just a little bit here and talk a bit about how the DEA was trying to say that all of the experts that wanted to provide testimony were not actually experts. I'm sure you're aware of this whole thing, which is bonkers to me. It's like world-class experts on this molecule with many papers published.
Oh yeah. Let me give a shout out.
Show me your credentials. Like, where do you come from?
It was nuts. Yeah, I should shout out the experts as well. I don't know that there's a comprehensive list, but they deserve to be mentioned, because the other thing, when I was working on the tryptamine one a long time ago, I talked to a lot of people and asked them to help who had done work. And many of them said, I support what you're doing. It's terrible. I disagree so much with the DEA. But to be honest with you, I just don't want to draw that kind of attention to myself. I'm really sorry. I just don't think it's a good time for me to do this right now. I can't fault those people for doing that. I get it. Like, I understand why no one would want to do it. And I guarantee none of these experts wanted to do it either. Like there was one MD PhD student named Joseph Hennessy. He's in medical school and has spent 2 hours every week for the last year working on this just to get on the stand, and for this DEA lawyer to say like, oh, you haven't got your MD yet, like, rejected, you're not enough of an expert for me. Like, this is like, so all these people who had dedicated so much time, who had really like amazing experience, like these were the most perfect diverse array of experts. You had students, you had senior researchers who were looking back on a career of using this compound, you had ex-military people, epidemiologists. Like the SSDP lawyers, Robert Rush and Brett Phelps, did an amazing job assembling this team. And it was Elijah Ullman, Elena Jaster, Tanner Anderson, Raul Ramos, Lindsey Cameron, Harrison Elder, Joseph Hennessy, David E. Nichols, of course, and Jason Yonkin, Joseph Palomar. There were, I think, others, but it was like all these people deserve immense credit for doing this, because it was like horrible for them, I'm sure, going in front of this group.
Yeah, it's really disingenuous to see this kind of behavior from a group that we fund and are supposed to trust. It's really tragic. And I think if government wants to be trusted, we have to start behaving better. And DEA could probably behave a lot better than they have, especially here.
Oh my God. Yeah, just the amount of time that is wasted. I mean, there was this one, oh no, I'm forgetting. I actually don't think I mentioned his name. He was like a melatonin. He was a chemist who'd done work on melatonin, who works for Radius. Now I'm forgetting his name, but he had like a really like impressive kind of confrontational style with the judge, and he directly said it to the court. He was like, at some point you are just wasting taxpayers' money. Like, this is, you're taking all this time, because they'd allotted 10 days for this hearing, and all this time to try to prohibit a substance where you can't provide a single instance of like an ER visit where there's a analytically confirmed DOI overdose. With DOC, there's like a tiny bit of evidence, and it's true. Like, I don't know how any reasonable person could have sat through that and not felt that what we were being subjected to was pure absurdity. And every day after the hearings, because you're not allowed to record anything. It should have been live streamed. This stuff should have been open to the public, but it wasn't. So I would have to go and I'd have to take notes. And so I have like notepads full of my attempt to transcribe everything as it was happening, that I would then read out loud and post on my Patreon, which are free for people that want to listen to them, at patreon.com/Hamilton Morris. And I recommend listening to them, because this is like all people have is me reading out loud all of my handwritten notes from the trial. And that will give you the best idea of what was going on, because it's so crazy. You wouldn't even, like, I don't know that I would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes.
So on the expert thing, like, was the judge sympathetic to the DEA's plight that these folks were not experts at all?
Well, okay, here's the other unfortunate thing, is that expert has a precise legal meaning that I wasn't fully aware of, and I think most of the experts weren't aware of. So an expert isn't an expert, it's a person deemed an expert by the court. So like, David E. Nichols is only an expert in what the court has deemed him an expert in through pre-hearing statements and a consensus among the judge and the attorneys. It's like a very bureaucratic definition of the word expert. And so what would happen is someone would be deemed an expert in one thing, but if they weren't an expert in some slight modification of that thing, then the government could yell objection, and then they would say that they couldn't testify. Like, one example would be David Nichols hadn't been deemed an expert in, what was it, in like the history of psychedelic research or something, or in research itself. Like, he didn't have a PhD in the concept of research. Like, it's like, it gets into like extremely pedantic, borderline philosophical territory at times. And so then if he's not deemed an expert in research, then he can't opine on research or whatever. Like, it's some kind of truly bizarre stuff.
It's really disappointing. But worth noting, I suppose. I guess I'll probably at some point in my life see the inside of a courtroom for some bullshit like this. Hopefully not for a church, but we'll see. And
You should, because I think it's important that people see this. Like that's the reason that I was being so insane about keeping notes on everything and doing these and I'm actually posting the final day of the trial on Patreon tonight, and I was being so obsessive about capturing everything because you would not believe this stuff unless you saw it. It is so ridiculous. And like that said, the judge actually did seem relatively fair. And he was, for the first time in any controlled substance hearing, acknowledging research harms, which is normally not a criterion that is included, meaning harm to scientific researchers. And that is huge for this, because that's really what's at stake. Like, if DOI is prohibited, that is going to do absolutely nothing to public health in terms of like the like the I mean, the stuff you would not even believe. Like, at one point, they were criticizing this epidemiologist, Joseph Palomar, because his surveys hadn't included nursing homes. like with the implication, of course, being that, like, because you didn't look in nursing homes, there very well could be nursing homes full of people who are addicted to DOI and DOC, like this kind of stuff. This is like the genuine level of the debate that is at play. And like he can barely establish this existing at all among like people in clubs in New York City, but maybe that's just because he wasn't looking in nursing homes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's such a strange set of arguments. So yeah, these lawyers just didn't seem ready. Like, they seemed woefully unprepared.
No, but there's no preparation, because I mean, this is like, what is the famous quote? There's no using reason to change someone's opinion on a issue that they didn't arrive at with reason. I just made it sound much worse than it actually is supposed to sound, but that's the idea. Like, this is not, there's no preparation for this argument. No amount, everyone in the world could work together to make a argument that DOI should be illegal, and they wouldn't be able to come up with a good one because there isn't one, because it shouldn't be illegal. Like, and I even actually, you could say, one thing that I felt uncomfortable during this is that DOI is such an unbelievably bad example from the perspective of the government that it sets an unfair standard for other substances, right? Because that, there are other substances that in fact people do use, and they do become dependent on them, and maybe even in some tragic instances they develop problematic relationships with those substances and they fatally overdose, right? That does happen. But ultimately, the case is still the same, that prohibiting them is not a viable path toward protecting people from the harms associated with drugs. So in this instance, we had this this insanely perfect example of a substance that no one uses, where we could really make this. But what if they actually had some evidence? What if there had been some people who were, addicted to DOI? Of course, it's not physiologically possible to be addicted to DOI, but let's just assume that they had that evidence somehow. Like, it still wouldn't change anything, because the fact would remain that this is extremely valuable to scientific research, and that prohibiting it does nothing to prevent people from using these substances. Didn't work with heroin, didn't work with cocaine, didn't work with alcohol when they tried, doesn't work with anything. It's never worked.
Somebody just commented, Mario de la Fuentes.
Mario de la Fuente. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Mario de la Fuente he was actually, I feel bad forgetting his name. He was actually like one of the real highlights. He was so awesome. And his vibe, like I really can't commend the researchers enough on this. Like, I was actually moved to tears on the second day, because it was like just such a stark battle of reason and irrationality. And you saw so many years of propaganda being thrown at these experts. And it was very brave to stand up to the propaganda, because for these people, even saying something is to us non-controversial as there are uses of LSD that are not abuse. Right? Like that's like insane to them to say that. That is so insane that there were DEA agents in the stands. At one point, the question was asked, does all use constitute abuse? And this question was so insane, so crazy, that the DEA agent yelled from the stands, like, of course. So that's the level that all this is at. And I think there was a kind of moment early on where Elena Jasta really stood up that like kind of broke things. I mean, everyone was working together. It was, but that was, for me, that was like a moment at the beginning where I was like, oh, this is not going to be going down this path of pretending that psychedelics are dangerous. Like we're really going to make a evidence-based case that the dangers associated with these substances have been dramatically overestimated by law enforcement, and that this is a distraction from real issues.
Yeah, back to your point about waste of taxpayer money. Like, we're coming up a U.S. Thanksgiving. There's going to be kids that don't eat that day in this country, in America, and it's like, okay, we're fucking off in D.C. for some really strange crusade that makes no sense. I heard rumor, Hamilton, that this came about because these are some of the last unscheduled 5-HT2A agonists. Is there any kind of veracity to that kind of claim?
Yes. I mean, it just depends on how you want to go about it. Like, there, the chemical space is vast, and there are many, many things that could be used. But in science, it's important to have known references that are the subject of many different studies so that you can make direct comparisons. And this is actually one of many things that has interfered with psychedelic research, is because you have all this bureaucratic difficulty with a lot of these compounds, you have a lack of direct comparisons with a lot of controlled substances. And DOI was nice because, if you're using it to, for example, characterize affinity for 2A, then you could have that as a sort of reference point. Now, you can't directly compare affinity like across different papers. It's not a good idea, but it's nice to have it as like a ballpark reference point. So if something was way off, you could say, oh, okay, that's weird. So it is one of the last of the, I would actually say it is probably the last of the widely used research chemicals in scientific research that hadn't become a controlled substance. TCB2 is extremely rare compared to DOI. I don't even know that it's commercially available at the moment. DOI was a big one. Brian Roth used like 2,5-CN NBOH in the characterization of the 2A receptor. I believe it was, yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. So like there's stuff. I'm not trying to make this argument that there's nothing else out there, but it shouldn't be the case that we're even this deep into it, because DOB is Schedule 1 controlled substance, DOMs is Schedule 1 controlled substance, DOETs is Schedule 1 controlled substance. So they've got plenty of these compounds already. If they want to, all of these things could be charged under the Federal Analog Act. And this is such a clear-cut case that I even reached out to a chemist who used to be employed by the DEA and asked him if he'd be willing to testify against the DEA. And he said that he would be willing to, on the basis of saying that these things don't need to be prohibited because they're already covered by the Federal Analog Act. So that's the other aspect of this, that like, I'm not a fan of the Federal Analog Act, and I actually think it's a very bad thing. But if you were to look at it in the most generous possible interpretation, it is supposed to exist precisely for this reason, so that you don't have to prohibit every single psychoactive drug so that scientific researchers can still access them. And then if they find that somebody is distributing it for human consumption, then they can use the Federal Analog Act. That's the point of it. So they don't even need to be doing this. Is the other. I mean, they don't need to be doing this on so many levels.
Was that raised in the case at all? This Analogs Act covering?
Yes, it was. It wasn't a core feature of the hearing, but it was mentioned mostly in terms of the fact that there had been no Analog Act prosecutions, which is another piece of evidence that these are not issues for law enforcement, right? If like it would be one thing, again, like wouldn't stand by it any way, but like if there had been some situation where like you've seen Dirty Harry before, you know, that scene in Dirty Harry where there's like the Zodiac killer type guy, and Clint Eastwood like finds all the evidence, but then the liberal judge is like, well, it's not admissible in court because you didn't get a search warrant. And it's like, oh, the liberals have interfered with good old fashioned law enforcement. Like that's the idea. I think they even say that it's like a Berkeley judge or something, but but it's like, if that were the vibe, like, oh, there's hardworking police officers around the country and they're constantly finding, DOI in children's backpacks, but they just can't protect them because the Federal Analog Act is not successfully implemented in these instances. That would be one thing, but they're not even trying because no one has these substances, because they're not actually like used by very many, some minuscule handful of people somewhere every now and then, but it's obviously very, very, very rare.
Yeah. Like I've been around. I've been watching drug markets for many years. I've not seen this stuff ever become available, and not even discussed. Similar to the internet, there's no case studies of people even really using this stuff in the wild, which is fascinating to me.
The duration is very long, like much longer. Most people are not attracted to a substance that has a duration that approaches 20 hours. It's just too much. And this was another thing that Mario De La Fuente brought up. Is he made a lot of really good points, but one of them was that that there's a kind of natural, there's a sort of evolution, there's a selection at play, and that DOI has been around for essentially as long as MDMA. So why is it that MDMA is a drug that many people wanted to do when it was uncontrolled, and many people continued to want to do after it was controlled, but no matter what legal changes take place in our country, it doesn't really seem like anyone is all that drawn to DOI. Why is that? Because people don't want it. It's that simple. It's not a drug that people are drawn to. Now, even if they were, obviously prohibition wouldn't be the answer, but this is the reality. It's been around for decades and decades, and no one ever was interested in it.
Is this the first time we've seen this kind of effort against psychedelics? Like, I hate to call it MDMA psychedelic, but since the DEA tried to schedule, was worked to schedule MDMA.
Well, there were a lot of people who were ready with the tryptamines, and who I hope will be ready again should it go down the same path as the DO compounds. But no, that's one of the things, is this has continued and there wasn't opposition. And this is, I think, one of the really good things about this psychedelic renaissance is you have a lot of young people getting involved in the research and also politically involved in trying to dismantle the war on drugs. And, I would like to think that next time that this happens, that there will be a robust opposition assembled, because what happened was so important. Like the bravery of these experts and the lawyers and everyone working together in SSDP was really very, I'm a pretty cynical person, and the entire thing was like inspiring and really made me have some hope for the future, to see all these people working together to facilitate scientific research and to prevent the unnecessary criminalization of these substances.
Mm. Yeah, I was I did a live stream a few weeks before the case started with Robert Rush and a number of folks on the SSDP team, including the researcher Tanner, who you probably get to link up with there.
Yeah, he was
Clever,
great.
clever people. It was really awesome to connect with them all, and uh, just the young energy was really heartening for me. That there was some younger folks who are really taking this charge up and moving it forward, and yeah, it was just really great to see that, and I was very excited to hear that you were going to be there. And Robert Rush has helped out a few friends who've gotten some jams in the past, so I was really happy to see him there as well. And
He's awesome.
yeah, he's wonderful. I can't wait to meet him eventually. Yeah, it's just really great that there was such a coordinated effort. I'm sure it could have been even more coordinated, but I think like despite that, it was still pretty great. Um, was there a conclusion, or are we just halfway through at this point?
No, okay. So there was a conclusion. I'm finishing my recap of it right now. Everyone made their closing statements. There was, way more experts on the petitioner defense side than on the government side. On the government side, there was essentially just one scientist, and who was a very interesting person. Who I'm sort of curious about her involvement in all of this as well. I mean, it is like, if you, the whole thing is amazing to behold. Like that this entire apparatus has been assembled, that it's all so nonsensical. And I would hope that in hearing all of these arguments, that it introduced some ideas into the judge's head as well, because for all I know, this is the first time he's heard these things. I don't know what it's like to be a judge who works for the DEA. It may be the first time that you've ever heard someone, David E. Nichols is close to 300 peer-reviewed scientific publications. His CV was, I don't know, 80 pages long or something like that. No, I think it was 57 pages long. And you have someone saying, oh no, yeah, they're not really that harmful. It's like, yeah. And this is like, what reason does this man have to lie about any of that? He's, this is someone who's spent his whole life working on this. And he's telling the court very persuasively that these are not really substances that you need to worry about them, people becoming addicted to them or overdosing on them. They're extremely safe for most purposes. Of course, they then tried to say like, oh, are they always safe? Are you acknowledging that they could ever have a harm? They're constantly pulling that type of shtick. Like, but I think
about water, right? Like,
yeah, yes,
come on.
Yeah. Well, that they actually did. This was one of the there was this pharmacologist named Lindsay Cameron. I think she was the one that got this. It was one of the choice questions where the DEA lawyer asked her, would you rather give someone a glass of wine or a DOI? Something like that, a glass of wine or like a dose of DOI. Or thankfully she didn't say a glass of DOI. That would have been even better. But and it's like, what kind of a question even is this? Like the reasoning has become so abstract and bizarre, and then the government's own expert acknowledged that based on the criteria used by the DEA, alcohol would have to be considered a Schedule I substance as well, which was a kind of an amazing moment. Although I actually think that she was, as much as I hate to say this, I think she was maybe technically wrong, because part of the one of the criteria is that it has no medical use, and there are medical uses of alcohol. So I don't know, like,
Right.
but not that I really want to argue with her on that too much. But yeah, so it was, it was a really amazing thing. Though I think the final ruling will be made public early next year, and right now there's still some post-hearing kind of management of various things. I don't know that there's going to be a major update for at least a month, but I'm writing up a big analysis of everything that happened, and I'm trying to further interview some of these experts on my podcast to just try to raise awareness of all of this so that people know exactly how this goes next time they try this, or even better, so that the government is aware that people are observing all of this and become a little bit more careful about just frivolously prohibiting these substances and without any thought. Because this took a lot of resources from everyone, from the government as well, and it should not have happened. The hearing did not need to have occurred.
Was your sense that the judge took the non-DEA side, I don't even know what you call it, defendants of DOI, like seriously enough? Or how did that look to you?
And when I say the hearing shouldn't have happened, they should have never even proposed the prohibition of these substances. But I think it looked good. The judge seemed fair to me throughout the trial, and he seemed to genuinely listen. He didn't even have to listen to the research harm element. That was something that he allowed. I think that he was showing a lot of fairness and open-mindedness, and he doesn't state his opinions on things during the hearing, right? He's not saying like, that's a good point, or there's just people saying objection and the judge says overruled or sustained. That's kind of the extent of, so when I say that he seems a certain way, this is all like my own kind of indirect reading based on how tolerant he was of various types of testimony.
Mm-hmm. And like, one of the hardest parts for me, again, coming back to the experts part, like how was the judge around this kind of experts discussion? Like, who was and was not qualified as an expert?
I would say that he was fair-ish. From my personal perspective, it was not fair. That's my perspective. From the perspective of a DEA judge, who I would assume would have a very conservative appraisal of people's expertise, where only someone who has a PhD in epidemiology and 20 peer-reviewed scientific publications on epidemiology can be considered an epidemiologist. Like, okay, fine. Does that limit the scope of who can comment on these things authoritatively? Of course. And of course, there are many highly credentialed experts who are still wrong about things. So it's a imperfect way of defining expertise. But for the purposes of a federal hearing of this nature, I think it was conducted in a way that was relatively fair within the sort of conservative expectations of the whole proceeding.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad it went that way. I could have seen it going in a really different direction, but I think I've not seen so many judges be all the way as broken as I would have expected them to be in some cases. I'm so like disenfranchised with the federal apparatus that I'm like, where is trust? But there is some trust with judges sometimes. I might not have told you about this one, but a friend got popped about 6 years ago with I think a pound or two of mushrooms in Colorado. And as he's getting sentenced, the DA and the judge go to the back room and say, oh, these are actually kind of good. And they gave him like a week instead of like 20 years or whatever he could have gotten. Just fascinating that a judge and a DA would do that. So at that point, I started to pivot a little bit around my attitude towards the judicial system. But yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty easy case to decide, I think. Again, I think it's almost unfair that it was this easy, and that success in this is still questions how these things may go in the future, because you will rarely find a substance as perfect as DOI or DOC in terms of DOC is a bit, that's another possibility, is that they will prohibit DOC and not prohibit DOI, which would be really unfortunate because DOC is less studied scientifically, and the very, very, very small number of abuse reports were mostly related to DOC. And there's a sort of UN convention that has controlled DOC, but Soren Shade, the producer that I work with, he had noticed that the UN convention also controls 4-methylthioamphetamine, and that's not controlled federally in the United States. So I don't think there needs to be perfect symmetry between the Controlled Substances Act and this UN convention. But, you know, again, none of this stuff makes sense. So you're just constantly trying to decide what matters in the scheme of this labyrinth of nonsense.
Cool. I have one non-DEA question for you. Is there anything we want to wrap up on this DEA topic, this case topic?
No, I think that's, I mean, I could go on about this for hours, but cool. I think that's, yeah.
People will follow up on your Patreon. You're going to put out a bunch of free stuff on there. So folks, go check that out. I try my best not to say this name on the show. Mike Tyson recently got a lot of press, and he continued to hype smoking Sonoran Desert Toad venom. And this is something that's been, I've lost a number of friends over this topic. I don't know if you have, but I just like saying, hey guys, like, leave that shit alone. These things are going to go away probably because of Mike Tyson and people who are excited about smoking this thing. Like, do you have any kind of like updates, or do you know anything about the current status of Sonoran Desert Toad?
I don't. I mean, I was very interested in trying to fund some kind of population work when I was originally selling the pamphlet through Cream, and we did raise some money with the initial pamphlets, but I don't think it ever went to any kind of a population monitoring study, which I really think needs to be done, because that's the question. Like, what effect are we having on the toad population? Is it a much harder argument to make than I would have anticipated. You know, when I first started doing that, I thought, okay, just show people the chemistry of the venom, show that there isn't evidence that there's any other psychoactive component other than 5-MeO-DMT and maybe like a absolutely trace quantity of bufotenine, which nobody seems to care about. And that's it. Case closed. Use synthetic 5-MeO-DMT. But there is a unfortunate tendency to ignore that factor, to just challenge it endlessly, and that's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with challenging things or questioning ideas that are presented, but my concern is that there is a irrational bias at play, and that no amount of evidence is going to convince some people that it is irresponsible to promote the harvesting of this toad venom. So, you know, and like so many ecological, environmental things, it will probably be the case that by the time a really persuasive case can be made, it's already too late. You know, you don't want to get to the point where you can say, oh, look, they're critically endangered now. Now, does it make sense why this was an issue? So, it's also just kind of unnecessary, even if they weren't being, you know, driven to extinction. I don't think it's necessary. The point still stands. Anyway, I don't know that there's anything to say about it that I haven't already said. I just would hope that people not harm the environment for the sake of these experiences, which are very valuable. I get it. I of course get it. But, you know, isn't it nice to show your concern for the world and the environment by pursuing a way to have these experiences as non-destructively as possible?
Yeah. So I linked in the the YouTube and the Twitch comments to Robert Villa's 2023 paper that did a pretty good job talking about all of these concerns. And I hope people read that and check it out and hopefully stop abusing this animal that doesn't necessarily need our attention currently. It would do really well if we left it alone. And yeah, I'm with you that it would be lovely to be able to do some sort of population study, but I don't know that it's in the cards anytime too soon.
It's definitely possible. I mean, this is not saying it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
It should be done. It will be done eventually. It would be nice if it's done sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I know there were some efforts, but it seemed a little partisan by the people who were trying to do it previously in a way that just didn't feel great. But anyway, Hamilton, thank you so much for sharing with us about your time at DEA. Last one. Did you go inside the DEA museum?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I heard it was terrifying.
Yeah, it was amazing. I talk about that in the final report that's coming out tonight. Yeah, there's a whole. I mean, there's a gilded fentanyl chandelier that they fucked up and accidentally made acetylfentanyl because they apparently don't know the structure of fentanyl. But it's I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. It's really dark. And Robert Rush said that it was like well, I won't even maybe say what Robert Rush said, but
he was sending me photos and I was terrified. But yeah, thank you so much, Hamilton.
Yeah, thank you.
Find your Patreon.
Patreon.com/Hamilton Morris. The first 3 dispatches are available at the moment, and they're definitely worth listening to. They will give you a strong idea of what is going on.
Amazing. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks, Hamilton. And I hope we get to do more with you in the future.
Yes. Good talking to you.